Good afternoon. My name is Rebeccah Heinrichs. I'm a senior fellow here at Hudson Institute, and I have the privilege of being joined once again by the Honorable Christopher A. Ford. Dr. Ford is the Assistant Secretary of State, performing the duties of the Undersecretary for Arms Control and International Security. It is my pleasure to have him here today to discuss some changes to the MTCR. And what I'd like to happen is Dr. Ford will give some remarks, and then the two of us will sit together on the stage and then have a brief conversation, fleshing out some of what he provided and explained today. So with that, Dr. Ford, please join us at the podium.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be back here at Hudson, where I spent, I think, 5 years as a senior fellow, and it's great to be back. And I'm sorry we don't have more of an audience today. It's just virtual, but it's a pleasure to have the chance to talk. It's been quite a while since I was at this podium here at Hudson back in February of 2019, I believe it was, with my colleague Tim Morrison, who was then at the White House, and I believe now he's here at Hudson, if I'm not mistaken. And we were talking about a reform proposal, an effort that the U.S. government has been trying to make at the missile technology control regime. And I'd like to talk a little bit about that effort and where it's gone and where we, as a matter of national policy, are now going. Now, the problem that we spoke about back in February of 2019 was the challenge presented by the fact that the 1980s era technological benchmark that is built into the MTCR guidelines, under which a strong presumption of denial is expected to apply to exports of what are called Category 1 systems. That is defined as things that can carry a payload of at least 500 kilograms to at a range of at least 300 kilometers. That benchmark has not, in some respects at least, held up very well over time. In particular, advances in unmanned aerial systems, or UAS, have led to a great explosion in the capabilities and the beneficial uses of such systems, and of systems that technically meet the Category 1 definition, but that don't, in fact, present the kind of nuclear weapon delivery threat that the MTCR was established in order to help forestall. So that's a fancy way of saying that as applied to certain categories of unmanned aerial system, in other words, the MTCR is in danger of becoming out of date. Now, with respect, to be clear, with respect to actual missiles and rockets, or indeed the sort of high-performance cruise missile that one might actually use to deliver a nuclear weapon, of course, we had and have no quarrel with the MTCR standard. Quite the contrary, we think it makes eminent sense to apply a strong presumption of denial for such high-threat systems. But the difficulty came, as we talked about here, the difficulty came with less capable varieties of unmanned aerial system, in connection with which the presumption of denial has had the effect in practice of largely shutting MTCR partners out of an important and a growing UAS market. Now, since non-MTCR partners remain free to sell whatever they wish under the regime, precisely because they're not MTCR partners, this represents not only a net loss for those countries that are responsible enough to join the regime, but also a net loss for nonproliferation, as the market for such low-threat systems is effectively ceded to the least responsible international players, those folks who don't actually worry about things like MTCR standards. And so that's why, way back in March of 2018, the US proposed an adjustment to MTCR controls that would have carved out a subset of Category 1 UAS based upon their maximum airspeed for treatment as if they were Category 2 systems, effectively making these slower and less threatening systems no longer subject to the strong presumption of denial that applies in Category 1. This US reform proposal would have protected, we think, what needed to be protected in that important regime, while yet allowing a degree of relaxation for transfers of lower threat systems in order to permit all of humanity to take better advantage of the myriad ways in which UAS now, which was not the case back in 1987 when the benchmark was set, all of those ways in which UAS are increasingly used in both government and private sector applications all around the world. Now, we thought that proposal made a lot of sense, and for the last 2 years and more, we have been promoting this reform in MTCR fora. We've repeatedly also made technical changes and various other adjustments to our reform proposal in response to issues raised and ideas that were suggested by our MTCR partners. The challenge, however, is that the MTCR is a consensus-based organization in which even a single country can hold things up indefinitely. Now, we're very pleased that many of our partners have indeed supported this reform proposal, but thanks to foot-dragging by some, it is not yet possible to amend the MTCR controls by consensus. Now, we're still going to keep promoting that proposal, for we do still think it represents the right way to update the MTCR regime in the face of technological change and thus save that very important regime from obsolescence, while still preserving what is most important in it and protecting non-proliferation equities. But as Tim and I signaled here at Hudson back in February of last year, the United States is not willing to let U.S. interests be forever held hostage by consensus decision-making. While we will still keep pushing MTCR reform, therefore, we are now announcing a modest adjustment to our national policy as to when the strong presumption of denial, as it's called, can be overcome in exporting slower and thus less threatening UAS. The key to this new policy lies in remembering that a presumption, by its nature, can sometimes be rebutted. A presumption of denial is not a prohibition, and it has always been permissible to make Category 1 transfers when there is a compelling reason to overcome that presumption, and such a step is well justified in terms of the non-proliferation factors that are specified in the MTCR guidelines. Now, we're all familiar with the idea of a presumption in other contexts. Most famously, for example, is we are familiar with the presumption of innocence that exists in criminal law. Just to give one example, because it's widely known. That is, of course, the principle that one should be presumed innocent of wrongdoing until actually proven guilty. Now, as that example makes clear, the central feature of any presumption is, of course, that it can be overcome. If not, it wouldn't be a presumption at all. It would simply be an ordinary rule. So I would argue that rebuttability, if that's a word, I'm not sure it is a word, but rebuttability is inherent in the concept of a presumption. To take the presumption of innocence as an example, there would be no criminal justice system at all if the presumption of innocence couldn't in fact be overcome by appropriate evidence. And it's a central purpose of the criminal procedure system to provide a way to determine when that's occurred. Now, that's just one example, as I've indicated, but the point should be, I think, clear. Presumptions are, by their nature, things that can be overcome in sufficiently compelling circumstances. So while observers of the MTCR scene often casually assume that the strong presumption of denial for Category 1 exports is simply a prohibition, that's just not the case. And understanding this is the key to our policy. That understanding is implicit in the guidelines and has been all along, but it's the key to understanding what we are doing now. Specifically, with our new national policy on Category 1 UAS exports, the United States is now setting forth a careful and a balanced approach within the MTCR guidelines, and that's an important point to make as well, that for the first time offers a clear explanation of certain circumstances in which the strong presumption of denial can be overcome. This new U.S. policy largely tracks the structure of the reform proposal that I just described a moment ago, the initiative that we proposed a couple of years ago for the MTCR, except that we are implementing the MTCR's strong presumption of denial, in this case, within the national discretion permitted us in the MTCR guidelines. So, to be clear about this new policy, under this new policy, the strong presumption of denial for MTCR Category 1 UAS transfers will be overcome for a subset of unmanned aerial systems that have a maximum airspeed of less than 800 kilometers per hour. This policy, I should emphasize, will change nothing about how we handle faster UAS, which present higher risks for WMD delivery, systems such as cruise missiles, hypersonic aerial vehicles, and advanced unmanned combat aerial vehicles, UCAVs, if you will. Those systems will continue to be effectively non-exportable, except perhaps on rare occasions. Our new approach will merely mean that we deal with lower threat, lower speed UAS more flexibly than before, as if they were Category 2 systems. I should also emphasize this policy does not mean that we will subject transfers of those slower, less threatening systems to a strong presumption of approval. That's not the case either. All we are doing is exempting them from the strong presumption of denial. There will be no presumption of approval, and all proposals will be evaluated on their own merits. Nothing also will change in the strict U.S. standards that today go into deciding whether or not a transfer should occur in the first place. We will continue to approach each transfer on a case-by-case basis as a whole of government decision that takes into account all relevant factors and policies, including U.S. national security, nonproliferation, and foreign policy objectives, as well as the recipient country's capability and its willingness effectively and responsibly to use and to safeguard U.S. origin technology. We will continue our extensive assessments of the risk of controlled items falling into the hands of unauthorized end users, irresponsible actors, state adversaries, and terrorists. We will continue to evaluate all transfers against the MTCR guidelines and the standards set out therein, and to require appropriate end use and end user verifications and certification and end use monitoring as needed. All military U.S. transfers will continue to be subject to State Department-led assessments under our conventional arms transfer policy, as well as to Defense Department-led assessments of technology security as applicable. And all civil transfers of UAS will continue to be subject to the Export Administration regulations and the standards that are already well established therein. We will continue in the United States to abide by our MTCR commitments, of course, including those that relate to pre-notifying Category 1 transfers, and we will continue to promote responsible standards of behavior in UAS export and use, such as, for example, in what's called the Joint Declaration for the Export and Subsequent Use of Armed or Strike-Enabled Vehicles, and will seek to develop further international standards for the export and use of armed UAS. It's true that the best way to proceed would have been to clarify these issues across the entire MTCR regime through the adoption of our modest reform proposal there, so that all partners could harmonize their approaches around a sensible maximum airspeed threshold. But as I indicated, at least one MTCR participant seems to have prioritized reflexive opposition to anything the United States proposes over sensible reform of the MTCR guidelines in the face of technological change. That's unfortunate, both on its own terms and unfortunate for the regime. For unless naysayers change course, the MTCR's technological standards, set more than 3 decades ago in 1987, will simply become more and more out of date with the passage of time, and stress upon the regime will needlessly increase. In this context, we are pleased to be able to take at least a small step forward on our own by implementing an analogous reform entirely consistent with both the letter and the spirit of the MTCR guidelines. We continue strongly to support the MTCR as an important element of the broader global nonproliferation regime, and I look forward to talking with you, Rebeccah, about this as we move to the next phase of this presentation.
All right. Well, terrific. Thank you so much for that great overview. And we are going to dive right in here because these changes, my understanding is they have been made today. And so this is kind of a real-time change that is happening now. And so I know there's going to be plenty of viewers who are curious for more information and more details about this. You know, my first question would be, you reiterated multiple times that this is a modest change. It's a modest change, and the United States tried to find consensus before we made this change, and yet it took a long time. You were here last year, but you were working on that before you came here to talk about that. So what does this portend for the future in terms of the United States thinking about other changes that we might want to make, and how we approach the consensus approach and trying to get everybody on board before we make a decision that we believe is in the interest of the United States of America?
Well, I would stress that what took so much time here was our effort to work through the consensus-tied processes of the MTCR regime. We gave it the old college try, and indeed, as I said, we're still trying to bring it forward, and perhaps our articulation of this approach to understanding when the presumption can be overcome, perhaps that will help others address these issues perhaps more flexibly and creatively. But our hope, sort of looking forward to the future is, we hope to get this particular change ultimately adopted by consensus, but if it doesn't, we still have this national policy in place. Now, what took long, as you were describing, is the process of trying to bring our allies and partners in, or MTCR partner participants in the regime along with this reform proposal. Ultimately, it hasn't worked, but international institutions move at the speed of international institutions, and national policies don't necessarily have to move that way. I'm not, it has taken a long time for the technological change of the world to make the tension within the regime as apparent as it has been. But any future changes on the basis of national policy need not, of course, be tied to to that sort of laborious process of consensus building. And we'll have to see what events transpire, but now that we have for the first time articulated both a process for thinking about when the presumption can be overcome and have experience in so doing, I think we will be well positioned to react however it may be appropriate to react to future challenges as we go forward without necessarily taking nearly so much time.
And I think it is worth noting, you and I were chatting before we started here, and I think you made a great point about how even though we are making this change to ourselves, even though we couldn't get consensus, that we're making the change first transparently before we move forward, and so that is a standard in which we're trying to set and a precedent we're trying to set.
Right, I think that's actually a really important point. Thanks for bringing that up. I mean, what we are trying to do here is find the right balance of using national discretion for compelling reasons, but also not just doing it opaquely, but putting it on the record. I mean, this is not, we want this to be a model for how to think about responsible export policy under the MTCR. And so this is not being done behind closed doors with opaque standards and letting people find out about wherever things may be afterwards. But the critical point here is that we are doing this in the open. We have explained our approach to this policy to our partners in the regime for a long time as we tried to get them to agree to it themselves. But this is we intend this to be a model for appropriate, thoughtful, prudential, on-the-record adaptation to change in the environment. And that, I think, is a sort of a meta lesson that I would like people to draw from this. It's not just about what particular airspeed. It's about how to think about the responsible exercise of national policy responsibilities in a regime that allows a considerable degree of discretion.
And I think that's important to bring up that point because the context, of course, is we are in an era of major power competition. We've had several big speeches by cabinet-level officials laying out just the seriousness of the competition and the threat that posed from major powers such as China and Russia, but China primarily. And so I think that's important that we make that distinction that we are unlike them, and we're being very transparent in what we do, and we're not obfuscating what we're doing or trying to keep it a secret, but it is transparent and in the open.
Well, and the things that I described in my remarks, all of the standards and policies that still apply. It's not as if with this change in our approach to which category of system are treated as if they are Category 1 versus Category 2, that everything else gets thrown out the window. We have an entire, as I outlined, an entire laundry list of extensive policy considerations that we always have and will continue to apply to transfers of any sort. So.
And then speaking of China, China is the one who's, and correct me, feel free to correct me, but driving a lot of this desire because to be able to make exports that make sense in this new context. China sits out in front, having exported more of light capabilities over 5 years than the United States has in a very, very long time. And many nations are looking to cooperate and to co-develop with the United States on a variety of weapon systems. So again, you mentioned that this change is modest. It's an airspeed change, a particular airspeed change, and it's very specific. It's very limited in scope. How should industry partners, engineers out there who are trying to figure out how to produce these capabilities to get them into the hands of the customer of the United States of America so that we can export them to allies and partners, be thinking about this announcement that you're making? What's the message that you want to be able to communicate them, both specifically in the very near term and then as we look out into the next 3-5 years?
Well, I think the first message to send is that to remind everyone, I think this policy not only is a change substantively in what we are, how we approach considering potential sales, but I like to think that it's also a signal to industry and to the potential customer base that this really is an on-the-merits, case-by-case question in every case. If you happen to have a system that you wish to sell to a worthy recipient, this makes it easier to come to the appropriate licensing authorities and make the case. And it makes that much more of an individually merits-based decision than perhaps it was before in the days when people, without really thinking it through perhaps so much, assumed that just because it says presumption of denial, that therefore that was the same thing as an outright prohibition. It isn't, and I think we are charting and modeling a responsible way to think about these things, and that is an important signal, I think, to send both to would-be sellers and would-be buyers.
And that's very helpful. And I chatted about this a little bit. I don't think you can speak too much on the record, but when you're thinking about, because obviously we're, to drive this kind of policy, there's a need first, which has made us start thinking about making this particular modest amendment. Can you talk about particular areas or different countries that would be interested in this in particular, different contexts or theaters? And feel free to just say you can't.
We try to avoid talking about particular sales ahead of time. It's a complex process, and obviously, if one were to suggest that a particular sale is being considered, and for some reason for the many policy, there are many policy off ramps that have to do with controlling technology, controlling U.S. technology, end use issues, non-proliferation assurances, and so forth. We like to avoid talking about specific sales in advance. But in terms of specific systems, by virtue of the fact that we've articulated a very clear technological benchmark of airspeed, I'm sure it's possible for knowledgeable industry and potential customers to go through their list of systems and see what is now to be treated more flexibly than before.
Great, and then so I think with that we can deduce then too that we're not thinking, there is not a certain dollar figure that we're already thinking of foreign military sales based on this, that's a little bit cart before the horse. Right now we make the change and then we're going to take case-by-case basis, and then...
For the most part, we don't ourselves drive sales. We respond to interest and requests. Industry responds to requests, and then they come to us for licensing to permit things to move forward. I think perhaps this signal that we're now sending with the President's pronouncement that's being rolled out this afternoon, I think perhaps that might have a ripple effect through the demand base, but we shall see. Okay. We will respond quickly and efficiently, and with our Political Military Affairs Bureau and the Department of State is locked and loaded and ready to handle licensing that may come in, and that's their job. They do it very well, and have been doing it at a great pace, notwithstanding the pandemic, I should say. We'll see where this goes.
And then I think that for a broader policy implications, the Trump administration more broadly, we've looked at various arms control treaties. Obviously, this is not arms control treaty, but we've looked at the INF treaty, in which we tried for so long to get Russia to comply with that treaty before we finally made the decision this isn't working. We're the only country that's being effectively restrained by this treaty, and so we're going to withdraw, and then now we can move forward with looking at what weapon systems we can now deploy that we might not have been able to before the INF treaty. And we've done it with a variety of other treaties that didn't make sense anymore. And I would say, is there something to that we should be taking from here that fits into that larger context about, maybe it's very difficult to find consensus and to work with people when we have very conflicting interests, especially with major power competition. So you didn't mention which country was particularly hard at arriving at consensus in this, but I think we can all deduce who that was. At what point do we say we have very conflicting interests in this, and so arriving to consensus is just simply doesn't make sense in the era of major competition, in particular with Russia and China?
I would say the answer depends. There are things on which we still hope and think it may be possible to work with them constructively. They have gone to a lot of trouble to narrow those range of issues through policy choices they have made, which is awfully unfortunate, but it's not a null set. I think one of the interesting things about the great power competition that we face these days is that while we in the US have, I think, finally awakened to the fact that it is necessary to do a great deal more by way of competitive strategy than I think our policy elites were willing to admit for most of the post-Cold War era. That still doesn't mean that this has to be an unremittingly hostile context. We do seek to engage with both of our great power competitors on areas where we think it's potentially possible to do so. Just next week, we will have a number of meetings in Vienna. Our new special envoy for arms control has a team that will be meeting with Russian counterparts to talk about the possibility for a future for an arms control framework. Mm-hmm. We also have a team from the department that will be meeting with Russian counterparts, exploring ways in which to advance the cause of stability and predictability in the outer space domain. These are important. These kinds of engagements are important, not just despite broader problems in the relationship, but to some degree because of them. It is precisely because of all the dangerous and destabilizing things that Russia is doing in outer space, for example, that it is important to do more to work on coming up with understandings of what appropriate norms of responsible behavior might be in space, for instance. We need to pursue an arms control framework with Russia and with China precisely because they are doing dangerous and destabilizing things and building up their arsenals, and hope that that may be a way to impose constraint. It doesn't always work, and as you point out with INF, sometimes arms control falls apart on it runs aground on the bad faith of some of its participants. We'll see where this goes, but I think that the key takeaway is that we are trying to be both competitive where they force us to be competitive, but also appropriately cooperative wherever we can still find opportunities to work together effectively. And the answer to that's going to vary across from one issue to the next.
Great. In the sense, I will. Are you able to talk about what you're expecting or how you would anticipate, since you've been working on this, you've got a good idea of how some allies and partners and adversaries, competitors, however you want to describe them, might respond to this particular change? Do you anticipate this having a larger ripple effect from a positive perspective, or perhaps negative complaints, condemnations from others?
I'm sure you can imagine, a player or two who will say utterly predictable things, complaining about this change. I do think in practice, though, that the many months, the years that we have invested in engaging with our partners and in the MTCR context, there is no, in some level, there's no, the fact that we are doing this as a matter of national policy, I think has been to some degree expected eventually. When Tim and I sat here a couple of, more than a year ago now, we made it pretty clear that this was not a process of indefinite suspended animation that we would be willing to tolerate forever. So I don't think anyone's going to be too terribly surprised by this, and I think they understand the parameters of our proposal and how and why it is reasonable and not a throwing to the winds of any kind of restraint, because we've made that very clear through all of our interactions with them in the MTCR process. So I'd like to think that the reaction will be, except for the predictable propagandistic complaints from a few, I think it will be understood and that it will, I hope, will be a catalyst for more responsible and creative thinking about how to make sure that the regime responds flexibly and appropriately to change, the whirlwind of technological change that has occurred since 1987.
Whirlwind, and I think it's my hope, just looking at this from a policy perspective, that we've gone through this exercise and maybe have recalibrated, although it's something kind of a hard metric, can't really have metrics there, but that we will be even better over the next couple of years in thinking about making some of these changes smoothly and quicker as we need to, having gone through this very long and arduous exercise, I think, for the right intentions, but finally coming to the conclusion that conflicting interests are just impossible sometimes to reach consensus as quickly as the United States needs to as a matter of policy. I did something else, something did stick out to me in your remarks. You were specifically talking about how, I'm just going to quote you here, as you said, this policy will change nothing about how we handle faster hypersonic aerial vehicles and advanced unmanned combat aerial vehicles. Those systems will continue to be effectively non-exportable, except perhaps on rare occasions. Can you talk about that, except perhaps on rare occasions? Should we overthink that? How should we think about that in terms of how the United States might make a decision like that? That's very case by case and rare.
Well, I guess by its nature, it's hard to predict exactly what circumstances might perhaps fit into that category. I think that is an artifact of the fact that it is necessarily the case that under those systems that remain under the strong presumption of denial for Category 1 systems in our implementation of policy, even that presumption, in theory, can be overcome. Now, that's going to be a lot harder to do, and that's why I stress that these are, this is, if it happens, it would be a very rare occasion. But I think it would be a category mistake to say that one could absolutely never, under any imaginable circumstances, say that, because that would be actually to misread the guidelines, which are very clear that it's a presumption that we're talking about rather than a prohibition.
And then I would just, say from I've written about this and spoken about this, but since I mentioned the INF Treaty, now that the United States is out of the INF Treaty, there would be certain weapon systems that the United States might consider, major power competition, that we do want to sell now, that we are now lawfully able to deploy or to sell, that might challenge MTCR guidelines. So my question then is, are you able to indicate that there might be some other things that we're already thinking about, particular amendments that maybe you can't mention specifically, but that there are ongoing things? In other words, that this is the first step in a series of steps that we might see rolling out over the next several years to adapt to the major power context.
I think all that I can really say here is that we evaluate all such questions on a case-by-case basis. If an appropriate and compelling case were made to move forward with any given transfer, then I think we've shown with this policy that we are willing to look flexibly and creatively at things and will respond as appropriate under the circumstances. What those circumstances are and what our answer would be if we face them, obviously I'm not in a position to talk about, but I think we've signaled that we are thoughtful participants in a process that evaluates all available data and applies appropriate standards to them, and we're not rigidly cabined by sort of reflexive assumptions about what the rules mean. And I think we're modeling responsible and responsibly flexible behavior in these respects. So we'll see. Perhaps I can come back here and we can talk more about these things as events unfold. So.
We would love to have you back when that does happen. So thank you so much. If there's anything else from the audience here. With that.
I should say also, for those of you who want a little bit more of the extended dance mix of these on these topics, we will be releasing a fairly extensive policy paper at the Department of State, I think this afternoon, to help add a bit of context and gloss and history to this, a bit of a build out of my remarks here today. And of course, the presidential proclamation itself ought to have appeared shortly ago on the White House website, and I would refer you all to that as well.
Thank you so much. Arthur, do you have one that you'd like to ask?
Thanks. Quick question for you, Chris. First of all, just want to say I think that this change is going to be welcomed very much by people within the aerospace industry as a whole, but also policymakers and also allies too. This has been a long time coming, as you were saying. You remember we sat on the podium together just across the hall a year and a half ago or so, talking about bringing this kind of a change to the MTCR plenary in the hopes that maybe possibly some common sense would dawn there, and it didn't quite work out. So I think everyone is pleased to see the U.S. taking this common sense move in the way in which they're doing it. So it's definitely very much welcome. I think at the same time, some will say that from say an engineering point of view, that airspeed limit, some will say that airspeed limit will be in need of updating in a couple of years. That there are, in fact, some will say there are already examples of UAVs, autonomous systems that exceed that airspeed limit. That'll make it more difficult to compete on a global marketplace where Chinese and others are going to be moving ahead with those kinds of developments. So my question for you is, do you anticipate now a periodic review process of the technical requirements for exemption from Category 1 in order to keep up with the evolution of autonomous systems as they apply to large UAVs in that category?
And for those listening here, that was my colleague Arthur Herman, who's done quite a bit of extensive work and research on this topic. So thank you, Arthur, for the question. And that'll be our one single question, since we have an audience of like 4.
Well, I mean, I guess the safest thing to say is that it is implicit in our policy change and the rationale for it that we do pay attention to the degree to which the approaches taken under the regime are congruent with where technology is. And I suppose it follows from that if technology were to get out of whack with the approaches taken in the regime, again, it might be worth revisiting. We don't have any specific plan for exactly when and how to do that, but it is implicit in the entire project that the evolution of technology and how well the regime maps against the world that it is trying to shape outcomes in, how well that fits. If at some point it doesn't fit, I suppose we might have to have additional conversations, but that's not, we're focused on this particular, and implementing this particular approach right now, and we'll see where technology goes. I have no doubt that many things will change, and the question is which ones do and to what degree.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the question, and thank you again for continuing to keep all of us here at Hudson and those at home updated on the great work that the administration continues to do to make sure that our agreements and our treaties are all there to further American interests, and to the extent that they become inhibiting American interests or strengthening the United States and our sovereignty and our ability to preserve peace and make sure that our allies have what they need to continue to dissuade potential people who would act aggressively, that we will amend and change, and we're not going to be shackled by by agreements and treaties that harm the United States and our interest. And so I think this is just another example of the administration taking that very seriously, while also being completely transparent and responsible, in contrast to, as you indicated, some of what some propagandists might say and some other competitors. And I think that we should anticipate that is exactly the kind of criticism that they'll make for this.
Sure. And I do want to stress we've done this within the MTCR regime in ways that are consistent with both its letter and its spirit. We use MTCR guidelines to help guide the exercise of our discretion because they are important. We, the United States, played an important role in creating those guidelines, and the principles that the MTCR is designed to protect are important principles. So we think this is precisely why this is I think a model of a responsible path forward.
Thank you so much. Once again, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you all for watching from home. Please do stay safe, and please do check out the Hudson Institute's website as we continue to have many virtual events to continue to bring information and research and content to you all, because policy will continue to move on even though we're at home trying to stay as safe as possible. Thanks again.
Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure.